When do you think we'll get to the point when using AI at work feels about as unusual as sending an email or searching online for something? Because we're definitely not there yet. Even I'm not there yet, and I've been using AI heavily since 2002. I'm still testing things. I'm still changing how I do certain things, changing how I work, and I'm still finding uses for it that I hadn't even, what didn't even occur to me 6 months ago. But we've been here before with other things. Something arrives, everything feels strange for a while. We spend years working out what we're supposed to do with it. And then eventually, somehow, parts of it just becomes, well, normal. I remember in January 2008, the index finger on my right hand started hurting. And it just didn't stop. If I'm being honest, it didn't stop. And by the following January 2009, I was in hospital having an operation after being misdiagnosed. So what ended up happening was they thought it was something else. They operated on me and it actually wasn't the problem. And I realized that fairly quickly because after the operation, I was in exactly the same amount of pain, except now I had a bad wrist as well as bad fingers. Now that was nearly 20 years ago, and my hands still hurt pretty much constantly because I have RSI or repetitive strain injury. And having the ability to not use my hands like I used to, honestly, right now it doesn't consume me anymore. It is what it is. And I've built the way I work around the fact that my hands aren't going back to how it was in 2007. That's what I'd call a new normal. And notice it doesn't mean something got better. It just means something changed and eventually the way you work had to change around it. And I don't think AI is one of those yet. Soon, but not yet. But according to social media and the blogs, people have started behaving as though it's already there, it already is. And that's probably where the panic comes from for the rest of us. There is a voice inside us going, am I falling behind here? Or should I be using Claude? Or should I switch to ChatGPT? Or everyone's talking about Gemini right now. Do I need that as well? I get this a lot when I'm training people, genuinely in almost every single session I do. So there are three things I want to do in this video. I want to show you where AI actually sits at the moment using a framework that I created and I take to organizations called the Story Lens. I want to explain why collecting AI tools is probably the biggest single reason people fall behind. And then I'll give you a really simple 5-day test that tells you honestly how far into your own AI new normal you actually are. Now, just to let you know, it doesn't take 5 days. So just want to let you know that. Now, I've spent about 15 years helping organizations make sense of digital change. And the best way to understand disruption isn't always data and trend reports. Quite often, it's actually story. And when I realized that years ago, I built this framework around one of the oldest story structures there is. Stranger comes to town. Something arrives in an established world. The world resists it. It reacts to it. It changes around it and eventually settles into something new. 7 stages. And the one I'm talking about right now is the new normal stage. And AI isn't anywhere near that stage, as I said. I would say we were in the stage before, which is the adaptation stage, which is we know the stranger, as AI, isn't leaving, but we're still changing our behavior around it and still trying to work out what sticks. Which means if you're sat there wondering whether you're falling behind, I'd say, honestly, no. There isn't an established AI new normal yet, not across work generally, and probably not in your working life either right now. Even though individual things may already be starting to feel normal. But adaptation is also the stage where I see people waste the most time. And there's one particular way that happens. What I see constantly in rooms, whether it be face to face or over Zoom, is somebody telling me they've tried ChatGPT and Claude and Copilot, and this usually because the work account, like work told them to use it. And they had a go at Perplexity last month. And then I asked what they can actually do with any of them. And it's the same three things across all four tools. I can write emails, I can summarize documents, I can tidy up some notes. And actually, there might be a few more things, but it's kind of those are the main things. So what's happened is they've tried four tools, but they've really only learned one. And I'm not having a go at anyone because I do exactly the same thing myself if I'm not careful. Something new gets released, it looks incredible, and there's this pull to kind of move everything across to it. But every time I do that, I'm basically starting from scratch. That's not going to help. So I don't think the question is really which AI is best. I think it's what you're actually getting good at. And I'm definitely not saying don't experiment, because now's the time where it's relatively free to do a lot of things. And I don't think it will be soon, or next year or so. Now's the time to try. So experiment with uses though, rather than tools. Pick one primary tool, maybe a second if there's an actual reason, and then go deeper. Get really good at ChatGPT or Claude. It actually doesn't particularly matter which one, as long as you're building on what you learned last week rather than starting again. I don't think the reason you feel behind is that you've used too little AI. I think it's that you've spread it across too many things to even get properly good at any of this. And this is where the 5-day test comes in. As I said, it's not 5 days. I want you to do this. Have a look back at your last 5 working days and make 2 lists. List 1 is where you used AI without really thinking about it, simply because that's how you've always worked. List 2 is where you get halfway through something, or maybe even finished it, before suddenly thinking, hang on, I could have just used AI for this. Everyone I do this with has both lists, and most people are quite surprised by how short list 1 is and how obvious list 2 looks once you've actually written everything down. And I think that gap is really interesting, because list 1 is already becoming part of the way you naturally work, while list 2 is the stuff you're still having to remind yourself about. Neither is right or wrong, because we're still figuring all of this out right now. But here's the question I'd ask next. Take one thing off list 2 and ask, what would you need to happen for it to become something you just naturally do? And if you're not sure, honestly, one of the easiest things you can do is use AI itself to teach you. Tell it what you do for a living and what a normal working week looks like. Then ask it for a few practical things to test that you haven't tried before. Then try. Because some will be useless, and that's fine. But every so often you'll find one where you think, you know what, that's really useful. I'm going to do that again. And you do it again and again and again. And eventually you don't have to remind yourself anymore, because it just becomes part of how you work. It's the habit essentially that you've built, which is what moving towards a new normal actually looks like. It's not one big mode. It's just a handful of things you stop thinking about. So going back to where we started right at the beginning of the video, I don't know exactly when using AI at work will feel as unusual as sending an email. And honestly, I don't think anyone does, including the people who sound very confident about it. But you don't need to work that out today anyway. You just need to find one thing that's useful enough to become part of it. So find that one moment from your last 5 working days where you could have used AI, but only realize afterwards that's the one you test. And try and do it this week. If you want to work out where you actually are in that story, because there's 7 steps to this stranger comes to town, subscribe to this channel where I'll be breaking down all 7 stages of the story lens and what each one looks like when you're living through it, showing you examples of how it's in all of your favorite TV shows and films, and ultimately using it as a metaphor to help when it comes to change and judgment, and ultimately get your head around this whole AI thing. All right, take it.